Every year, psychedelics are becoming more accepted into mainstream culture, and people all over the world are asking themselves, how can I get the skills, foundations, and tools to build a meaningful career in psychedelics? Well, that is exactly where Vital comes in. Our 12-month interdisciplinary practitioner training program is robust, inclusive, and most of all transformative, both personally and professionally. Our graduates have gone on to do many different things in the psychedelic space, like working at ketamine clinics, consulting on clinical trials, opening a retreat center, starting their own coaching or wellness practice, and even launching a psychedelic media and merchandise platform, and so much more. Classes start January 23rd, and our application deadline is December the 20th. But if you apply and enroll before November the 19th, you'll save $750 from tuition. Head to vitalpsychedelictraining.com to download our full course curriculum. You can also check out our events page at psychedelictoday.com to sign up for an upcoming Q&A session or to join an expert-led topical taster webinar. Find out whether Vital is the transformative journey you've been looking for.
Hey everybody, what's up? It's Joe here. Just wanted to let you know about an upcoming class we have going in Denver. We're actually producing a Navigating Psychedelics 2-day edition for all of you out there that want some in-person ed. So we just ran it in Miami, and it was an amazing success. And we're going to do it again in Denver on November 10 and 11. And we would love to have you there. If you want to learn about it, psychedelicstoday.com/events. We are going to run through 2 days of material. We're actually even going to give you an impressive breathwork experience that hopefully helps you understand that experience and how it's useful. So anyway, go over to psychedelicstoday.com/events to learn more, and we would love to see you there in Denver.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Vital Psychedelic Conversations. This is David, your host, with Erika and Jono, and we are going to dive into something, really interesting. It's just occurred to me on a car ride home from the supermarket to try and get these two beautiful people on a podcast together, and they both said, yes, I'll do it. I can't believe it. So here we are. Thank you so much, Erika and Jono. And it means a lot to have this conversation. I think maybe, Erika, do you want to just say hello to folks and tell people a wee bit about who you are in a nutshell?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, David. My name is Erika Dyck. I'm a historian in Canada, and I have been working on the history of psychedelics, partially in the medical frame, but also in a cultural sense over the last almost 20 years now. A little over 20 years, I've been asking questions about their place in this history, and that conversation has changed a lot, and I'm excited to dive into it today.
Awesome. That's great. You've been doing this for 20 years. Awesome. Jono, over to you, sir. What's your little spiel you want to tell folks about you?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jono. I'm the co-founder of Kaizn. We are a company that specializes in running modern rites of passage journeys using altered states of consciousness. I'm also a coach and a psychedelic facilitator. And on the side, I'm a very, very amateur historian, and deeply excited to have this conversation today.
Awesome. Yeah, we were just having a chat, Jono and I, in person in Israel, and you mentioned something called hermeneutics, and I wasn't sure what that was. So I definitely want you to talk about that and define it for us. So part of the conversation we got here is, Erika, you are a teacher on our Vital course. And Jono, you are a graduate, so we're in our first cohort. And we're here to talk about the Vital experience that we've shared. And the first question I always like to ask on one of these conversations is, what do you feel like is something really vital right now that we should be talking about? Like something that really, has to be part of what we learn, what we're just mindful of, and what we're just exploring as a conversation that is kind of intricate and essential to the field of psychedelic studies and understanding. Erika, can I give that one to you to start with?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for that easy question to start us off. I've been thinking a lot about psychedelics for a long time, and I keep sort of wrestling with this question about whether the future of psychedelics is really about psychedelics or whether psychedelics are a tool for unlocking a different kind of future. So, to go back to one of my favorite characters from this history, that guy Aldous Huxley, who wrote The Doors of Perception. Now, I like to think of psychedelics as opening a door. They're not the end point, but a way of thinking differently about the future. And to me, that's really an exciting possibility for what this psychedelic renaissance holds, that it's an opportunity to really take stock of what we want to revive about the past, whether it is psychedelic or not. It might be something more sacred. It might be a kind of humanity or a kind of way of thinking, that focusing on psychedelics allows us to think differently about how we want to organize those thoughts, those actions. And I think it's a really exciting opportunity to invest in this kind of renaissance moment, to really blend these historical impulses with an opportunity to think about a different future. I think
Beautiful.
that's
Yeah, and
wonderful.
that's what I was thinking on the way back from the supermarket. We should talk about, it's not just about the psychedelics, it really isn't. It's much deeper about humanity, society, and life itself. Awesome. Thank you, Erica. How about you, Jono? What are you thinking is one of the vital things we should all be talking about?
Well, firstly, I just want to say straight back to Erica, bang on the money in my view. Um, and I guess my point kind of really does intersect in with what she was saying, which is, for me, I'm thinking about psychedelics in the context of altered state of consciousness and flow states, and what this general category can mean for our human experience, and in what that can do for an individual's human experience, and how that shows up in our collective and our capacity to change. There are some things that we need to deal with at the moment, and it's really hard to deal with it if we're not prepared to change as an individual first. And so, yes, it's a mirror point. And I guess the other bit I just want to sneak in as well is the role of community with psychedelics. I think that we can occasionally get a little bit lost that it's the psychedelics, the medicine, and the more I'm seeing is that the medicine is community and psychedelics are the implementation tool of that medicine.
Nice, nice. And I think where we're holding now in the world in real life is pretty intense times. Wherever we are in the world, and I think a lot of us are hoping that psychedelics are going to be this kind of magic, panacea that's going to help us, save ourselves and experience a new kind of paradigm of reality. And I am really interested about the past, what we've learned from the past about what psychedelics are and are not. And perhaps, just Eric, if you don't mind, just maybe painting some pictures for us around why do you think, having studied the history of humanity and their use of plant medicines and psychedelic states of consciousness, why are we even interested in this stuff called psychedelics? Why do humans have this kind of repeated relationship again and again through different parts of the world that have never contacted each other, through different kind of epochs of time? Why do we keep having these non-ordinary states of consciousness play really important roles in societies and cultures, do you think?
Yeah, there's a really deep sort of searching quality, I think, within this history. And I have to be a historian sometimes, and the word psychedelic is really introduced in the 1950s, but I'm going to use it here anachronistically and just extend back as a bit of a shorthand for grasping at some of these concepts that didn't always have names, and that don't fit neatly into a discipline or a paradigm or even a kind of language that we can readily say, like, these are all the same. And I think that diversity is really key. It's really important. We recognize that, we have archaeological evidence and paleographic evidence to suggest that early ancient cultures are, grasping for these sacred plants or incorporating sacred rituals that may not even involve plants, into different moments of questioning. And it's, in some ways, I think it's sort of comforting or humbling to think about our own existential crisis that we're living in right now for all sorts of varieties of reasons, and that psychedelics are emerging and really finding a lot of alliances. I think they're not, just one small group of people now. Where this is on, my kids can watch this stuff on Netflix if I'm not paying attention. Like, it's pretty mainstream right now, but I think it's a revival of this kind of questioning that moves beyond particular linguistic categories, vocabulary, ontologies, disciplines. It necessarily requires a kind of collective and diverse set of responses to answer some of these really complex questions that are before us. And again, I look at that with optimism. I think this is an opportunity to challenge some of these preconceived or some of these sort of traditional categories of difference and really think about sameness or think about ways of coming together that maybe need to be reevaluated. We see different psilocybin mushrooms, for example, although not even understood as such in Egyptian ceremonies at times of war. We recognize this certainly, deeply embedded in indigenous cultures, either for seeking wisdom in terms of in moments of famine, in moments of struggle, in moments where we might think of as putting it into a healing framework. And I'm stumbling over language here intentionally because the language doesn't necessarily match the experience. And I think, as a historian, that's really intimidating, but it's also really exciting to try to look back and recognize that there are some common threads that continue to play out in this sort of history and present of psychedelics.
Yeah, thanks, Erika. And maybe just to talk about your work and how have you been able to separate the psychedelics piece, the plant medicine piece, from the consciousness piece? Like, is it consciousness? Is it spirituality? Is it like what are some of the terminologies that you're even using to kind of define and describe what you're finding humans have been doing for thousands of years?
Gosh, I'm sure I'm not doing it well, and I'm sure if you ask me this question again in the future, I'll have a different answer. I think I'll answer it in sort of my own journey. When I started this project, it was the late 1990s when I was looking at this as a question of the sort of the history of science and even sort of political history. I was trying to understand, who was paying for these experiments? Why were they conducting these very medical experiments that were, in the first instance, the ones I looked at were LSD and mescaline trials that were conducted in Canada, in a place in Canada that was introducing publicly funded healthcare. They were looking for cost-saving initiatives. And, in some respects, this is a kind of political economy of medical experimentation. Very different, we might think of, than thinking about flow states or a kind of psychedelic awareness or opening. I'm looking at, annual health reports and policy documents, maybe dry stuff by comparison. And yet that was the window for me, or the doorway for me, that sort of plunged me into this world of psychedelics. I came in for the politics and the science, and I came through that recognizing that part of what the investigators I looked at, people like Humphrey Osmond, the guy who coins the word psychedelic, but he came in as a sort of British scientist who, I'm pretty sure every one of his psychedelic trips was in a tweed jacket. He looks kind of like an avatar from a 1950s movie. But this is a guy who is writing to women who are psychic mediums, and he's connecting with indigenous people. He sat in ceremony, in a peyote ceremony, and he tries to sort of bring some of that insight into what he describes as the setting. This is before the coining of the phrase set and setting, but he arranges his clinical room to look like the inside of the teepee that he had sat in. And he starts to honor some of these traditions, again, even with awkward language and the terminology kind of clashing. But this really inspired me to think outside of that medical political context and to go searching more widely. So, what were these psychic women bringing to the psychedelic field? And some of it is terminology and energy, literally and figuratively, and really a different kind of network of people to give a kind of investment, or make an investment, but also give ideas to, like, how do we think about consciousness? This is not just the domain of Western trained psychologists, but maybe we need to think about, people who have convened with, the paranormal, or people who talk to their ancestors through visions. And that involved a whole different set, and a very, I think, in some respects, a risky or bold or radical way of thinking about doing science. And that just enchanted me. I became fascinated by, like, how do you, like, if I go to a history conference, we don't hang out with people studying the paranormal very often. Like, what efforts do I need to do, and what applications do I need to make? How do I get a grant for this? All of those mechanisms, the structure of research and science is not designed to encourage us to make those kinds of those connections. And yet here were these folks hanging out in a place that has a lot of winter, staring up at the prairie sky, looking at the Northern Lights. These come from the records. I'm ventriloquizing them. And they're thinking, who do I want to help me give meaning to this experience? And that has sort of nourished my history ever since, in trying to think, okay, well, here's what we have in this box, but what does it look like if we sort of tear down this wall and start looking over here? Imagine how a different way of organizing this information would look like in the Amazon rainforests amongst the Hunniquin, or how does it look when you ask a priest to interpret this kind of material? And anyway, now
Beautiful.
I feel
Yeah. Thanks, Erika. Okay, we've started now. Yeah, I'm just thinking about all the different questions people around the world have been asking, and different answers as well. Jono, for you, when you're looking back historically, what are some meanings that stand out to you around humans' experiences with non-ordinary states, spirituality, these kind of big questions?
Yeah, I think that the first thing that really comes to mind is history is not an academic subject. And what I mean by that is that it's an opportunity to consider yourself in the first person, to be like, oh, wait, hold on. These people that are living 1,000, 2,000, 4,000, 6,000, 8,000 years ago, they're anatomically identical to me. There's nothing different about them. Like, fine, I have the benefit of, let's call it, the accumulated culture that stepped over me and that shapes the way and the frameworks I see of the world. But the universal human experience of the same major challenges are all there for everybody who lives on this planet. The challenge of birth, the challenge of growing up, the challenge of understanding why we're here, what we're doing, what's right, how should I be in this world, the fear of death, how do I move on safely? Like, these are universal themes that are the same in every like archetypal story structure that we see. And when we go back to these ancient cultures, that they weren't segregating our information landscape, like Erika was saying, into these different structured ontologies that have a specialism. Right? They were sitting and they were interpreting wisdom and philosophy and medicine and spirituality all under the same arc. It was such a rich thing for them. And it was based on, what does this mean for me in my human life? I always like to think that the great philosophers that we still turn to today, they weren't writing academic papers. They were writing a philosophy on how to be wise in life. They were creating real-time philosophy. And I think that our quest is no different than their quest. It's the universal questions of why we're here. What are we supposed to do? And how do we move rightly through this world? And I'm just really minded by this kind of idea that categorization is one of our greatest problems we got at the moment. Every single human being on this planet has more information available to them at the palm of their one finger touch. But the way that we've categorized this information somehow turns it into a pursuit whereby it's not about your experience. You're somehow interpreting the world's experience, rather than really looking into that. This is just all the accumulation of individuals searching these huge questions. And yeah, like, do we think that shamans were dealing with the hard question of consciousness? Yeah, for sure. Do you think philosophers were working around that question? Hell yes. Excuse my language. And that just delights me, if I'm being honest, to think that we are continuing this body of work. And I think that this thing around the difference between that what psychedelics in many ways are doing are helping us to experience what our forefathers were experiencing, to connect us into that human lineage. And I think that's fascinating. But yeah, so just some thoughts there.
Jono, can I just add a little? I love what you're saying, and I want to throw midwives into that, searching quest as well. These women who were serving as, bringing life into the world, and sometimes those same women are functioning as today we might call death doulas, who are also looking at different psychedelic products or psychedelic ideas and plants as they thought about birthing and dying. And we sometimes sort of keep them outside of that context, and partly because they wanted to be kept outside. They didn't want to be criminalized for the work that they were doing. But I just want to add that in as just to triangulate that conversation a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, really, we might as well just put this front and center in the conversation, knowing your work, Erika, particularly as a woman in psychedelics today. The further back in history we go, the more we realize that women were the gatekeepers of the wisdom and the practitioners of experience. And just really feeding into that, if we're going to talk to history, we should make sure that is front and center of how we relate to the medicine, as it was through the feminine for a very, in multiple cultures, who, as David said, hadn't necessarily intersected to be culturally aligned. This was just something that was biologically arising. And, psychedelics are a biological medicine, right? There is something in there that is deeply important in my view.
Lovely. I really love that we're talking about this, and I'm getting a feeling of the importance of our inner worlds and experiencing life and experiencing, complexity and the meanings of life, and being able to have that kind of shared and guided, and ceremonies being a really important part of that. That psychedelics don't necessarily have to be part of the equation. There's breath work and chanting and fasting and meditation and dancing and all kinds of things that can help us to go deep within. And at the same time, there's just, a lot of family and culture and nature itself that are just there, accessible at all times. Just simply the breath. They give us that kind of gateway to the infinite, which is within us. And I often wonder, is it just our society? I'm quite against our contemporary world. I really am. I'm a bit of a Luddite and, hypercritical of some of our contemporary inventions and realities. So I wonder, did we need these kinds of rites of passages and ceremonies so that we did not become detached from each other or detached from our kind of inner infinite self? Was it a safeguard for that, or was it something else? Perhaps, I don't know. What would both of you think around that question about, what was it for, and what have we lost in a sense as time did evolve and we did start to lose contact with these traditions, rites of passages, and more, male, female, balanced energies and traditions.
I feel like Jono's primed for this one.
Yeah. So if I'm going to sort of I'm going to sort of talk to Western culture specifically, because I feel like it's my personal experience, so I can really dial into that. There are three times in Western human history where we've managed to integrate the head and the heart successfully. Ancient Greece being one of them, and that boom that took place there in terms of developing ways of being that seem balanced and unified and sacred and regenerative. And then the early Enlightenment also had this sort of wonderful moment where it was so present for us that we were, essentially the integration of the left and right hemisphere perfectly in balance. Art, science, culture, all kind of coming together. And I think one of the great challenges that that took place there for us is that the domain of spirituality stayed with the church, materialism went to science, and we created this kind of divorcing of these structures. And 300 years later, we're paying for this in a meaning crisis today. And the reason why we're struggling so much in this meaning crisis is that the big questions that we just all talked to have been essentially put into a category as non-important in comparison to a material reductionist worldview of that everything is discernible to its basic elements. And so for so many people today, inside of that sort of scientism that we've created, the advent of psychology did not really come along with developmental psychology. The Freudian idea that at 14 we're fully maturated, I think has had some quite big challenges in terms of removing why we would think that rites of passages or significant festivals and milestones are incredibly important for a human being. The idea that the prefrontal cortex for an adult is not fully formed till 25, but we send people off at 18 fully ready for life, gives you a good example of how our cultural context isn't actually married to what we understand in terms of our developmental needs. And ancient cultures that really knew this, they understood, just going to like the Hindu culture, for example, that I'm going to paraphrase this very shortly, but first we seek pleasure, and then when we're bored of pleasure, we move into our next iteration to seek fame and power. And finally, when we've satiated that lust, we move into seeking community. And finally, when we've fulfilled all of these, we go back to being nobody. That's 3,500-year-old understanding of a life cycle, which we just don't currently have right now. And James Hillman beautifully said it, like, we live in a naive culture, and it feels like a lot of Western cultures stuck at fame and power. We don't even know how to go through the other two phases that are sitting here. And I think what rites of passage journeys do is they give us an opportunity to step out of this like modern waking state consciousness where we're like hyperstimulated, disconnected and disembodied, and give us the opportunity to really dive into those deeply personal questions in a safe environment, in a communal setting where we raise the value of these questions. And in doing so, bring part of us online that so seeks and yearns to know these things, but we're told that aren't culturally relevant or important, because at the end of the day, there is no afterlife and you're just going to dissolve into the ground, become a bunch of atoms, and life is generally meaningless anyway. So the short answer for this is rites of passage give us time to stop, stand still, reflect, engage, and connect deeply to who we are and on a soulful level at a time when our culture doesn't really see a necessity for those things, except for if you're burnt out and you need to go into deep rest, or if you are medically ill. Those are the only two cultural circumstances where we have this liminal space for these things to emerge and reflect. And I think that's very reflective of why most people are burning out or getting sick, is because we don't have these pinpoints for those deeper questions. So that's where I think that rites of passages really come online for us as a cultural piece right now.
Yeah, thanks, John. Erika, what's bubbling away for you?
Yeah, I thank you, Jono, for taking the stab at that to begin with, because I really wanted to collect my thoughts a little bit as well. But I really loved what you were saying, and as you were talking, it brought me to a place that I've been recently, which is I was very absolutely honored to be invited to sit in a peyote ceremony with the Native American Church, and for me it was of course on many levels this was very important. One of those levels was that it was an invitation from the grandchildren of the people who had invited Humphrey Osmond to their ceremony. So there was a kind of historical nerdiness that was also really exciting for me. But that quickly kind of, faded away as I sat not only in ceremony, but even around ceremony, that is in preparation. And we kind of shared history, shared kinship, shared food. We shared a lot, and upon reflection, I was writing a little bit about this, and I've been in conversation with the members who invited me. It's really helped me to think about that community piece and what you were describing about the need for community, or the need to move beyond those individual moments for rites of passage, but to think about those in community. And I think, as I'm understanding now from this amazing group of people who generously welcomed me with open arms, um, that sort of breaking past that Western mode of thinking, which they said, stop being such a white girl, like think about, put those ideas over here, come with an open heart and an open mind. And I'm speaking bluntly, but they were, of course, lovely. But reminding me that I just had to check some of my preconceived ideas at the door, and really sort of open my heart and mind to these ideas of how we think about kinship. And kinship not necessarily being blood ties, but kinship being these shared circumstances and these shared existential crises that we all have a role to play in thinking about, theorizing about, and acting on. And it was a really amazing, gentle reminder that we're part of something bigger, and that those traditions, those protocols that are in place, were there to help really guide and hold a sort of container for some of these ideas. And I'm stumbling because we just spoke on the weekend again, and then she's like, don't use those words. So I'm trying to honor the traditional grandmother who guided me through this experience. This experience was a really useful reminder of, this opportunity to start unpacking some of these ontological differences and really use this as a moment of reconciliation and think about, what can we learn from pulling down these boundaries and thinking differently. And there was a second piece that I wanted to bring up, which is, as Jono, you were talking, I was thinking about, how meaning is ascribed in some of our daily lives and many of our daily lives, which is very economic, very financial. There's a really strong sort of capital transaction that occurs, and this kind of work is valuable at this price. This is less valuable at no price or lesser price. And I think that's also something that can possibly be revisited in this moment as we think about meaning and value, and again, sort of tease apart that language and these rites of passage. When we, as a historian, we're taught to think about memory and legacy, and that creates a different kind of meaning or a different kind of value that endures beyond the mortal life of a person. And I think that psychedelics may have an opportunity also to help us to interrogate some of that meaning making in our contemporary society, and think about, whether psychedelics become something that we can buy at a drugstore, or perhaps at if we can buy it in a marketplace. I don't think that is actually the end goal here. I think changing meaning and markets and values is much deeper than that, access to a substance, but really what we take from that and how we integrate that substance or ideas into our contemporary world.
Hey, Jono, maybe I can ask you to talk about your contemporary world that you're kind of co-creating at Kaizn and beyond, and what are some of these places that people meet each other and kind of to meet the parts of themselves that perhaps they've lost or they need to get to know a little bit better. So how are you kind of creating these more contemporary frameworks for folks to meet?
Yeah, no, I can definitely talk to that. And the thing that firstly comes to mind is just got to take a snapshot and see what's different about us as a generation versus the rest of human history. Like, what's unique to us, and the things that really kind of come across. And I'm just basing this off first person anecdotal work with clients and friends and myself, and the research is we are living in a time when community is not the same as it's always been. That is a significant statement to make, but I feel confident in saying it, in that more people struggle with the notion of being in community and the idea of communing together. Is that for a lot of people under the age of 40 who've been brought up on social media, who've lived in a largely digitalized environment, who've been through COVID, is that brings up feelings of discomfort for them. So our naturalized human state is uncomfortable. And yet so much of who we are is based around how we know ourselves in the reflection of the eyes of others. If you're the only person on this planet, you wouldn't actually know yourself, right? We require other people to know ourselves. And yet so much of what's taking place at the moment is that we are projecting a digital avatar of ourselves onto the world that makes us either feel better or worse about ourselves, that changes our internal narrative of who we are. And we're spending less time in communities, less time sharing hobbies and interests and passions, because that now lives on a Facebook group. That was Mark Zuckerberg's great thing, is like we bring communities together, but not human communities. Like he brings a part of us together. And so that the biggest thing that I see from doing this work at Kaizn is the thing that people are most grateful for is actually stepping into a heartfelt community. And that's taken us 5 years to build. It's going to take us a lifetime to maintain. And I'm under no illusion that we're anywhere close to being anything but a working MVP constantly. But you see people when we have online preparation calls and people kind of come together and we start to break down the barriers, and you're trying to get people to engage and go into breakout rooms. And thanks, David, teach me how to do breakout rooms. and all of this sort of stuff, and just the level of anxiety is so high. And then get them into the retreat where we use sweat lodges, ice baths, ecstatic dancing, group therapy work, and it is all designed to elicit a communitas experience. Because when that wall comes down, it's safe for me to be in my heart. When it's safe for me to be in my heart, I return actually back to what it meant to be a human being. Which, and I love that thing from that quote: "We're not Homo erectus, we're Homo amor." Like, we are humans of love, but it's so hard to be heart led, as Erika beautifully said, at a time when we live in a society that has a pre requirement of us to consume more to grow the society, and to work harder in order to have more money, to consume more to work harder, and that's the loop structure that we're in. And the average Londoner, and I just know this from the London data, sees 5,000 subliminal messages a day from advertisers telling them that they are not good enough, and if they buy this, they will feel whole. And you're like, that's a bloody problem, because actually the old way that we would make meaning out of that would have been and I work in longevity as well, and what you know about the longevity data is that people who have stable connections, who feel valued in their community, who have a good relationship with how they perceive themselves, live longer than other people. So it's baked into the data, this. And yeah, as you can see, it's an emotive conversation, but a really passionate conversation for me, because I think that we are not as far away as we think we are from getting back on the right track, if we can just all spend a bit more time outside of this digital hemisphere, or this digital world, and more time actually just communing together in community, experiencing altered states together, and meaning making together from those experiences, and collecting the wisdom that comes from them, as our forefathers and foremothers have done since time began.
Yeah, Johnny, you're so inspiring when you talk. It's awesome. Um, I was thinking about the way that there's some focus or some concentration around palliative care and psychedelics, and again, even sort of in this limited frame where maybe they'll work over here, and I think that still comes out of that more transactional idea. It's not necessarily in this grand holistic scheme. But I had the privilege of working with a palliative care unit on just trying to help them write their history, which had nothing to do with psychedelics. But it happened to take place at a time when Health Canada, here I am in Canada, was starting to give access to people seeking psychedelic experiences for health reasons, and they only did it in palliative cases. And so it occasioned an opportunity to sort of put these conversations together and think about it. And it was fascinating, not only the sort of openness that this otherwise fairly, traditional looking palliative care unit was dealing with, end of life circumstances, but people started talking about transitions and meaning and legacy and life and kinship in a way that just kind of opened up Pandora's box for having these conversations. And we started kind of sitting together. We sat in circle. We didn't call it ceremony, but we literally put our chairs in a circle and just shared ideas. And it was really a tremendous experience where we just sort of came into our hearts, as you beautifully put it, as we tried to make sense of, what's going on in these spaces and why is the government willing to share here and not in other places? That was a pressing question. And, it's interesting. I think it's anecdotal mostly, but I think NYU Langone, for example, has published studies suggesting that some of the people who've had the opportunity to have psychedelics, often it's psilocybin, sometimes it's MDMA, at least in the clinical trial data, they are outliving their palliative prognosis. And, no one, I'm certainly not going to say mushrooms will cure your cancer. But that what you described there, that sentiment of, changing our relationship to life is definitely sort of within grasp. And it doesn't fit neatly into a paper on, palliative care maybe. But I think it opens up that possibility of thinking differently about this relationship that you're describing.
Yeah, I'm just really prompted that so much of what we do in our rites of passage journeys are not about psychedelic medicine. And that's not to say it's not a profoundly important catalyst for the experience. But sitting in a group and listening to people, and like without a telephone in the room, and being present and really feeling into their human experience and letting it inform your experience, and letting the dialogus start to emerge, is like, we know that is where we have always found innovation as communities. And the idea that there is no one who represents science who knows all of science. So we need to start getting really clear about the fact that collective consciousness is the only way to bring together all the information we have and make sense of it. And unless we're going to put that out to AI technology to do that for ourselves, like coming back into a room where we can have those, let's call it academic or difficult conversations, or policy-led conversations, but lead it from the heart, like, in circle. I just think that's so amazing. It really prompts something in me. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about Vital as well. And one piece that was always super important to us from the beginning was we needed to have experiential aspects to this learning. It's not just academic. So we wanted to have it really beautifully curated from a kind of theoretical, multidisciplinary perspective, and history was a really important part of it, Erika, just to really give a sense of there's multiple meanings, and kind of human relationship is evolving, and we are part of that evolution. But we also wanted to make sure that our students understood this isn't a medical monopoly here. Like, this isn't just a mental health treatment modality. This isn't just about productivity or anything like that. It's not even just about spirituality and saving the world. It's really it's everything, and it's whatever each individual is in a sense destined to evolve it into. Then the second piece that we found was the experiential retreat that every one of our students goes on. That's where the magic happens for a lot of people. It's that being with people that you've been talking to on Zoom for 6 months or 9 months, and then being there, with them is, it's just almost like a unique artifact, I think, that we are rediscovering and giving to students, literally like an artifact. It's like, oh wow, I've never experienced that before. And it can make something within them also that is an artifact that they have never found before within them. And I tend to go down like some hyper spiritualized, cosmological understanding of what that is from a spiritual perspective. But wow, I really believe that having these experiences without this kind of medical clinical jargon necessarily complicating it with categorizations, but it being heart focused, usually in nature, it just brings something out of us that is within us that we all share, that is exactly the same as Jono was saying, that was 8,000 years ago. We are no different in a sense. In a sense, we are, I think our brains have trapped us, and that might be some of what we understand with the default mode network as well, how literally we have just become these kind of very efficient machine versions of heart-based humans. But maybe as a question for you, Eric, I'm interested. This could be like, what do you believe, or what does your research say? But also, what do you hope with your heart humanity can discover through more of us having experiences with psychedelics and non-ordinary states around maybe ancestors, traditions, cosmology, non-duality, that complex meaning making around life and death. What are some of your understandings and findings and hopes around this? Just to, before we move on to the next area, like, where are you holding yourself with where you're currently kind of sitting in your life experience so far?
You always ask hard questions. Really simple ones like, what do you hope for? I mean, I think that the word that comes to mind as you were talking, and then I'll try to make sense of it or maybe convince myself of it as I talk. Tolerance is a word that comes to mind as you were talking. I think that one of my hopes is that, and it doesn't have to be everybody taking psychedelics. It can be just tolerance towards difference. And I think psychedelics can help us to come into a place where we can appreciate that diversity is a strength, that difference is a strength, that sameness isn't necessarily, the strength or the goal that we should be striving towards. And I think something in that is really important to me. And I'll just finish by saying that, I thought you were kind of going in a different direction with your question, and it made me think about, when I was in my 20s and I started this research, and I was, trying to get research ethics in order to go and interview people who had been scientists working with psychedelics. And, the research ethics people were like, if they disclose to you that they ever took psychedelics, you need to report that to the police, and I was like, what? I mean, yes, they did. And no, I'm not. But the structures that governed my capacity as a researcher to delve into some of these questions, and maybe I was also, I certainly was naive and cautious and, worried. And so maybe I didn't push that as far as I could have, but the nature of the conversation felt very constrained, um, forgetting the ethics. But I mean, being able to talk to people about what they really felt about this, as opposed to just, kind of hiding and saying, I did this research and I promise you the CIA did not fund it. It was not unethical. I didn't try to cause brain damage in anyone, like just fighting off some of the sort of, um, the characterization of this past. And now, fast forward a few years, I'm not 20 anymore. The conversation is so different. And that really gives me a lot of optimism too. Like that we're having a conversation about like, what's our heart language about this? That is like it would be unheard of. Certainly in the context that I was working in. And I was working with, people who were very sort of psychedelic in their orientation. And that language just didn't seem accessible at that time, or it was risky to talk like that. So I like to think about it a little bit as a change of the conversation over time that also I think there is a pathway here to greater tolerance, as we sort of shake loose some of these categories and begin to talk across different divides. It's really wonderful.
Beautiful, thank you. And yeah, you gave your own personal experiences, Eric, about using peyote recently, and I think that is a beautiful disclosure, and it's awesome that we can talk about that nowadays. It feels really important that we can do that. Like we're not all pretending to like say, oh well, I read this research paper or I had this client that said that, or I read a book about it. But it's we can talk about our personal experiences. I think we need to be at that kind of mature stage in civilization now. And Jono, how about you, mate? I saw you writing some stuff down there. What are you thinking?
Yeah, I'm just really captured by the moment around what you were saying around tolerance. Difficult moment in the world, obviously, right now, without having to delve any deeper into that. But one of the things that really strikes me in like the last 10 years worth of research is in the West, we have two different visions of possibly of a human experience, and the way that we work. We have B.J. Skinner's behaviorist worldview, right, where we can be trained like Pavlov's dog or like the pigeons to do repeat things and get outcome structures. And that's not to say that that's not possible. It is there. It exists. We know it works. Otherwise, we wouldn't all be liking on an Instagram page incessantly when we're teenagers. But there's also, birthed into that moment that he created that was Csikszentmihalyi's worldview about flow states, and a worldview that said that there is an intrinsic calling that we all have. There's a reason for being. There is the great mystery, and that we all have capacities well beyond what we know in our waking state consciousness of ourselves. And just like, for me, that is the left and the right hemisphere of our human experience, right? And there's two worldviews that operate, and for so long, we've been trapped in this left hemispheric worldview. And what, as Erika was talking there, like, and especially around categorization and tolerance, like, what comes up for me is that the further we reach to the right, to the right hemisphere, the further we reach to these flow states and these alter states, the more our preconceptions of what keeps us apart are shattered. And it's, it's a universal human experience that sits there. And when I kind of really dial into that, David, you mentioned hermeneutics at the beginning, but because there is just such an excess of factual information, we've gone from having 4 different ways of knowing, the 4 P's, participatory knowing, procedural knowing, propositional knowing, and the other one that will come back to me. But we are so indexed in the propositional right now, and then we have more information than ever, but we are lacking in actually how to be in that experience ourselves. And the hermeneutics, when we talk about hermeneutics with suspicion, what we mean is when my left hemisphere of my brain short categorizes an entire person with their human experience that you could write volumes of books about, down to 3 propositions I know about them, that they are this and I don't like that, and they therefore are against me. And that is devastating if you want to create deep communities where healing, where we can all start to do the work of healing. And I so strongly feel that this is what psychedelics are here to do, is that they are, like Csikszentmihalyi's work with flow states, is that they are an offsetting of an eternal balance between these 2 hemispheres. And we've gone so far one way with this worldview where we are also gamified by what we do. We are the amount of information that I know because an algorithm wants me to know it terrifies me when I actually think about it. But on the other side, the amount of wisdom, I don't want to say that I'm getting, because that seems a bit wrong. The amount of wisdom that's available from us, from these experiences that we're having, that help guide us back to this other way of being, gives me radical hope. Radical hope that things haven't gone too far. It's just the pendulum has swung very far one way. And I think psychedelics are some of the momentum to take us back to the other way and back to ourselves, each other, and Mother Nature.
That's beautiful, Jono. Yeah. And I'm thinking about the Jewish Sabbath as well, and how amazing that is for just getting away from, that left side of the brain in particular, and going on retreat. It's really taking us out of that space. It's almost like going to rehab, and I think we need to go to rehab just to get away from Western society. I wanted to ask you a quick question, Jono, and then I've got a big one for you, Erika. Really looking at the 60s and 70s. John, I wanted to ask you about coaches. So since we've launched Vital, we're doing number 3 now. We have seen that so many of our students are coaches or want to be coaches. I'm a social worker, I'm a psychotherapist. We've got lots of psychologists, psychiatrists, marriage and family therapists. They're awesome, we're great. We have a part to play in the psychedelic renaissance. Yes, we do. But I'm actually a bit jealous because I wish I was a coach, because then I don't have to worry about losing my license for certain things. And I've just got more flexibility to work with different people in different ways. And it's a little bit less restrictive. And I think when we look at people that use psychedelics, the coach has a really awesome role here around how they can just meet people without having to check off a box of diagnosis, for example, or even just the kind of relationship they're in, or what is this kind of space that we are meeting each other in. So I'm interested, not as a neo-shamanic kind of archetype of a coach, but I'm just curious, what is this coach as it applies to, say, psychedelic work, integration work? How you appear at kind of looking at this role of the coach nowadays?
Yeah. So I'm going to start with just covering my ass on this one, which is the very things that I think that set coaches apart from therapists sometimes, which is the freedom that you're talking to be in the human heart and less within a categorized, structured framework of how to do things, is very powerful. But what that can and reliably does mean is that we've got a bunch of narcissists running around who should not be touching plant medicine and not taking people on plant medicine journeys. And I think that one of the things that the therapeutic model has successfully done is essentially reduced the danger of a client having a narcissist as a therapist. And I think that that's incredibly important, particularly when we're talking to psychedelic medicine. So I just want to preface that so that now I can be a bit more flamboyant with what I'm going to say next. I think that we made a terrible mistake in divorcing coaching and therapy. I think they're best friends. One is about the past and how you meaning make that, and the other one is about the future and how you plan and structure that. I think that I'm a personal fan of teaching teleology, which is helping people understand their unique reason for being here on this planet. That was taught in every mystery school in ancient Greece since the Eleusinian mysteries started. You will find it in all the other wisdom traditions. And that's just a joy. When you watch somebody who goes, oh my God, right, all of this trauma I've got, I can myelinate that into my intersection with my trauma, my talent, I can myelinate that into a life's work and a purpose. And that deep emotional encoding from these experiences give me a sense of mastery in this area that I never thought I had. And equally, my talent is coming online because these are things that I'm naturally drawn to. It's not like school with 10 subjects. I'm going to pick my lane. This is what I love to do. I've been very much feeling part of Erika's telos on this call, like just thinking like the depth of where someone would have been called to go and to excavate this incredible history that she's been doing. That solves mental health problems. I want to be really clear, like people finding their reason for being on this planet and finding a belonging on it, and community solves a lot of what therapy is struggling to resolve, I think. Because it's in a one-on-one format, and we're also going back to resolve trauma without being able to really say that this trauma was formative in driving you forward. So yeah, that's what. So for me, can you bring coaches and therapists together to work in a treatment team? Yes, in Kaizn we have people that work as psychotherapists, as coaches, as energy workers, as medicine guides. And like when you bring that arc together and bring them all onto one retreat and they really know each other, it's just what we were doing last week where you can dive. It's like, oh, cool, this feels like a coaching bit. Oh, no, this feels like psychotherapy. Oh, no, this feels like medicine work. Oh, no, this feels somatic. And have that all in one room. That, for me, is the future of healthcare on this planet. And I think coaches have a really important role because we are burnt out, because so much of our lifestyles are really messed up by the way that we've been living on this planet. And I think that that's what a coach's role is to create a life map and a lifestyle that's congruent with an individual, whilst also knowing that they can be supported in the therapeutic space by therapists who can go back and artfully do microsurgery on trauma and give it future meaning that's beautiful and powerful and inspires people to move forward in their lives.
Beautifully flamboyant. Thank you, Jono. Yeah, that was awesome, mate. Really, really good to hear. Erika, I'm going to pivot because as a historian, I really want to hear some of your thoughts around the 60s, the 70s. What was going on then for humanity when, we came upon LSD and then other medicines came, next. But what was going on there, maybe on a collective level, perhaps? And how was politics and policy part of the response to that? How do you look at that then? And then part two of the question is like, what do we learn from that for now? So it's quite a lot to try and wrap up, I know, and we're kind of coming towards the end. But anything that really stands out for you as kind of lessons from the past? What was trying to happen there? And was it the medicine talking or working, or was it what was right, what was wrong there? If you can just wax on that a
that's a fun question. I think in some respects, looking back, if we sort of try to come from a thousand feet, I think the Cold War is actually really important for understanding, why did psychedelics kind of bubble up in this moment, even if they did in particular, in a Western biomedical framework, for example. But that's not actually the whole story. That's the story that we've come to know. But as I'm working with a number of people in different jurisdictions, like psychedelics were bubbling up in a variety of different places and becoming a viable touchstone for trying to make sense of the world that was at least superficially cleaved into, two different pathways and nuclear disaster at the same time. I think this produced a very dramatic existential moment for many people all around the earth, not just in the Soviet Union and the United States, but all over the place. There is a military dictatorship in Brazil at the time that politicizes activities there. There are all sorts of decolonial initiatives as states are becoming independent. And at that geopolitical moment, I think this caused that kind of existential angst and a searching moment. So I think that the histories to date have really focused on particular key areas where we see a real sort of proliferation of interest in, what do we make? We're going to put psychedelics and perhaps other drugs too, and maybe music and art into this space, and that's going to represent hope and, pulling away from, we're not going to buy into the military industrial complex. We're not going to go to Vietnam, those sorts of things that have, I think, really focused on a kind of American-led logic. But even without that, I think that kind of proliferation of ideas around psychedelics really, really came to a fever pitch and gave a lot of hope. And also, unfortunately, became a kind of shorthand for the 1970s. The war on drugs, the United Nations coming together saying these are illegal substances, these are prohibited, they have no value, no medicinal value, and really putting strong language that was bought into by a variety of jurisdictions, and probably not bought into by the people who were at Grateful Dead concerts, or whatever, or Tropicalismo concerts in Rio de Janeiro, perhaps. But that it kind of like put the lid on, these powers are going to retain their power, whether they are Soviet powers or American powers. And I think that has, for a long time, that was sort of the way that the history arc went. In the 1970s, this all kind of grinding to a halt. And one of the luxuries of being a historian and being curious and having a driver's license is that I don't stay in boxes. My province is a box, so I'll use that metaphor. But, I've been driving around interviewing people who are now ready to share their stories. And some of them are 70, 80, 90 years old, and who are ready to open up and share their photo albums or their stories. And so what I've been doing over the last few years is trying to understand, like, what happened then in the 70s to people who had been sort of on the front lines of forging a psychedelic revolution, if you will. Some of them went underground, some of them went to jail. Many of the wives actually continued to carry those stories and protect them underground. Wives, daughters, sisters, it happened to, again, come back to that kind of feminine protection space that Jonathan mentioned before. Again, aligning with a deeper historical tradition, perhaps. And it's fascinating now as those stories are beginning to slowly emerge, sometimes without names, as people still don't want to be associated with something that was so deeply criminalized. But there's a whole kind of underground narrative that protected those stories and those hopes and that optimism. And we have an opportunity to weave that back in, to sort of braid that piece back into the contemporary narrative, instead of the tendency that I worry about today is we're better than the past. We're different from the past. Now we have the internet. Now we have fMRI machines. Now we have whatever it might be, greater wisdom. And, therefore we don't have to worry about there ever being a Timothy Leary again. But as Jono just mentioned, narcissists still exist. And the capacity to sort of take over this movement or this moment still exists, and we need to come together in community to help recognize that. And I'm learning from these underground folks, or folks who identify as being part of a 1970s, 80s, and 90s underground, that developing their own mechanisms for sharing information was key. Some of these folks were actually, if we go to San Francisco, for example, they're part of the Silicon Valley, they're part of the internet. So there's a double-edged piece to this. But developing their own ways of communicating and creating community in a space that is increasingly risky was part of survival. So I'm not coming to a conclusion necessarily, but I think how we grapple with information is one of those big questions that is on the horizon in psychedelics. And thinking with and about psychedelics is one pathway for tackling this other bigger thing that is not about psychedelics. But we have lots of evidence from the past to see that people who have coveted non-ordinary states of consciousness are playing a big role in how we manage information. Whether it's, keeping it in gardens or putting it in zines or sharing it on Arrowwood's vaults of anecdotal experiences, how we communicate our shared interest in non-ordinary states of consciousness is a big piece of this history, I think.
David?
Yeah, and I just want to throw in, what do you think of the term the psychedelic 20s, which Rick Doblin has called this
Ooh, that
decade?
probably makes me have an opinion about Rick Doblin. Um, yeah, I guess I need to think about that a little bit more. I'm a fan of sort of moving past like the psychedelic 60s. I was like, I feel like you couldn't have the 60s without the 50s. And then, if you say that, then you have to go all the way back to the like, I'm uncomfortable with giving it branding it in a particular way like that. But I also understand that despite my own view of the world, um, I've played soccer all my life. And I know this sounds like I'm not answering your question, but I've come to appreciate that you need diversity on your team if you're going to be successful. And I don't want the mentality of the striker to be the same as the mentality of the sweeper. Um, you need different voices and different attitudes to make a successful movement or team. And so I use that as my non answer to saying, I don't always agree with some of these categories or the vocabulary that's given to it, but I have to take a step back and recognize that that might be a really useful heuristic for gaining momentum in certain areas. And I don't have to be a striker. I can be a sweeper and watch the ball go in the back of the net.
Beautiful. Nicely done. Thank you, Erika. Jono.
Yeah, I was reading the opening to a book yesterday that's just come out called The Psychedelic Experience by a philosopher called Aidan Lyon, who I share a very similar interest to, which is to redefine psychedelic not as a drug, but as a state in which there are many different access points into. As a breathwork and a meditation teacher, I think that those are psychedelic experiences. So I also think that art is a psychedelic experience. There's a lot more breadth here, and I just really wanted to say two things. Really, one is, firstly, I remember Erika's lecture, which was right at the beginning of my Vital training, and it was just the one that like really gave me rocket fuel. And the big rocket fuel for me was, holy bleep, we don't actually know our own history well enough, and we need to know this quickly because this thing is moving quickly, and we lack ancient wisdom. Fine, I can accept that. We'll try and find it. But like, what about modern wisdom? Like, how can we culturally, contextually be using the right hermeneutics to talk about this space before, because it is so potent. And the opening line of Aidan's book is that for 6 generations since the Soviet Union was forged, is that every year there are thousands of guinea pigs that are drowned. And the reason for that is because they're called sea pigs. And so little kids put them in little containers thinking that they are made for the sea. And it's just shorthand for overseas pigs, but the language changed, the category changed. And I just thought that, he wrote this as an analogy for the misunderstanding of psychedelics. And I think it's very apt. It really gets you to the thing of why it's so important that we have people like Erika doing this work, because we need to get wise quickly. And that is a paradox unto itself.
Yeah, thank you. And it would be lovely to just ditch the word psychedelics, to be honest. It doesn't really have that much meaning. We're talking about something so beautiful and infinite and personal and mysterious that is within all of us and the whole bloody universe. Yeah.
Only because,
Go.
I was
Yes.
alone in the archives. It's like lonely in there sometimes with the dim lighting. And I found the original letters that, introduced the word psychedelic. So I have an obvious bias. I was pretty excited that day, and continue to be. But, I used to be with you and like, okay, this word had a particular moment and purpose. But I want to breathe into it just for a moment that they sat and talked about this for a while and played around with different words, and they were like, well, we don't want it to be too Freudian, and we don't want it to be too this, and we don't want it to be too that, but it's got some Greek roots and we want that. And the real care and deliberation that came to that sort of precipitated the founding of this word or the introduction of this word, that gives me real optimism. I appreciated that they really Osmond and Huxley, who sort of co-created the word, it's Osmond's word, but it was through a set of letters. They went back and forth on, how can we really want something that is sort of unmoored from structured logic. And even though these guys are, two British guys in tweed suits, but they really did want it to have a kind of movement, that it had a kind of flow to it that allowed for input from a variety of different ways of thinking. And like I say, I think they were quite expansive in their thinking on that. And so I'm going to defend it and say that the spirit of that openness, the spirit of that set of exchanges, their interest and deep curiosity for other ways of like giving meaning to that word is something that I treasure.
And funny enough, I just want to double down on this. I want it to be broadened. I want mind manifesting to mean more than just a drug state, to be able to hold a flow state, an altered state, to really grasp the breadth of what's possible. And I think that the hermeneutic that we just need to work on is the relationship between psychedelics in the 60s and the 70s. Like, we actually just need to shrink the size of that experience versus the totality of medicine experience, and then the word's back to its rightful place in many ways.
Beautiful way to end the conversation. Thank you, both of you. All right. I wish we had more time. We should do this again, but I think this idea of mine worked. So beautiful. Erika, you've got a couple of books coming out, so definitely tell people kind of where they can find more information about you and about the books that you got coming down.
Yeah, I think it's up on my website now, which I don't have the URL off the top of my head. But if you just Google me, I think it's one of the top hits. I've got 2 new books coming out. One is called Expanding Mindscapes. It is a book I edited, and it is an attempt to bring other voices into this conversation. We worked with translators and a bunch of just really amazing up-and-coming scholars who are pushing these conversations into non-North American jurisdictions. And I'm excited for this book because I think it's going to hopefully continue to sort of nourish this conversation and get us thinking about, well, what does this mean in a Muslim context? What did psychedelics mean in Pakistan? What was happening in a military dictatorship? How do you get radical in a military dictatorship where the consequences are really harsh in Brazil? Examples like that. That's one. And the next one is called Psychedelics, A Visual Odyssey. And it is, I hope that it'll be finished very soon. It's coming out in the spring. Both are with MIT Press. And The Visual Odyssey is really a story of psychedelics told through images and pictures. Some of them are sketches of things that people imagined or how they wanted the room to be set up in a medical context, but many are pieces of Indigenous artwork that have really brought together some of these ideas and sort of pushed us to think about the relationship to nature first. And psychedelics are part of that. Humans are part of that. This is not a story about psychedelics. This is a story about humanity. And we try to really weave that through the entire book to remind us of, the braiding together of different ways of thinking.
Beautiful. All right, Jono, I know what to get you for your birthday, mate. Erika, that's those 2 books. Wow. I can't wait to see them. Thank you. Beautiful. Jono, how can people find you?
Yeah, sure. So you can find us on the website, www.kaizn.co, which is KIZN.co. And if you're more interested about kind of more of the thinking that we've been talking about today, we have a white paper on there, which gives a bit more depth and structure around what we're doing as a business and the philosophy that sits behind it. And also, if you're interested in breathwork, meditation, cold swimming, dancing, or anything like that, we run community events across the UK and Europe. So come and find us. We'd love to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was an absolute pleasure. I hope you enjoyed listening, everyone. This has been a Vital Psychedelic Conversation with David Drapkin, Erika Dyck, and Jono Remington-Hobbs. God bless everyone.